Welcome everybody to another and a very interesting series of conversations on Sikh Studies. And let me tell you how all this started and what I'm doing here. Narendra Kripani, who is the founder of the Sikh Foundation, an old friend of mine, years ago, he and I started the first conference on Sikh Studies in the United States. And so recently, just a few weeks ago, right before his untimely death, he called me up and said, "Mark," he said in his distinctive voice, "it's time to do it again. It's time to test the waters of Sikh Studies, not just in the United States, but in Europe and UK." And he said, "I'd like you to moderate because we cannot have a conference of physical attendees in a pandemic, but we can do this via Zoom." Well, I thought this was a brilliant idea and I gladly assented. So here I am, and we've been covering some of the more just an interesting range of scholars and programs around the world. A couple of weeks ago, we talked with Apinderjeet Kaur Thakur in Wolverhampton and the kind of interesting work we're doing there. And today we're coming back to the UK with Dr. Gurharpal Singh, who is really a very distinguished scholar in several different fields. And one of them being Sikh Studies, and he's had a distinguished career at SOAS in London and elsewhere in the UK. And so I can't think of anyone better to talk about the wider range of Sikh Studies within the UK and the continent, for that matter, if he's willing to go that broadly. Even though, you know, this Brexit, UK is no longer part of the EU, but at least he's in shouting distance of other programs. So it's just with such great pleasure that I welcome Dr. Gurharpal Singh. It's nice to see you. I've followed your writings over the years, and it's good to see you. I almost said in person, but in Zoom, it kind of feels like in person. But you know, Gurharpal, one of the things we do is start with breaking news. And I think you have some interesting developments about this new chair, probably the first endowed chair in Sikh Studies in the UK at Birmingham. What's going on?
Yes, I think we really do have breaking news in a sense that UK at the moment doesn't have a fully endowed chair in Sikh Studies, but we are almost getting there. The University of Birmingham last year signed an agreement with the government of India to commemorate the 550th anniversary of Guru Nanak's birth. And a chair has been created, the Guru Nanak Chair in Sikh Studies, based in my old department, Theology and Religions. And last year, the university launched a global search for this post. Unfortunately, because of the outbreak of the pandemic, the search was put on hold. And I gather from my colleagues that the search will be renewed soon. So it looks like that we will break the glass ceiling here. We really struggle to create the kind of positions that we have in North America. And interestingly, if the post is filled, then we will have two positions in Sikh Studies at Birmingham. We already have Dr. Jagbir Jahuti Jol, who lectures in Sikh Studies. So this will be a senior appointment. And as you know, Birmingham is a center of the large Sikh community. And the Department of Theology and Religions at the university has a very strong international reputation in the study of religions and theology.
So Gurharpal, how does this come about? And why has it been relatively more difficult in the UK, which has an abundance of Sikhs? I mean, so just a thriving and a very important community within the UK. You'd think that Sikh Studies would have been established as an endowed chair or some kind of prominent position long before that. But why has it been so difficult, and how did this one come about?
Well, on the second question first, it has come about as a result of initiative by the government of India. 2019-20 was a year to mark the 550th anniversary of Guru Nanak, and as a result of that initiative, the government of India has offered some monies, not complete endowments, to universities in North America and in the UK. And here the University of Birmingham, in collaboration with members of the local community, had put forward a proposal which was accepted. Why it's been difficult? Well, we've had, that's a rather complex question, but the straightforward answer is that the threshold for creating a chair, the tariff is very high. We've had, as you know, in Great Britain, a very strong connection with, historical connection, the colonial connection with South Asia and Punjab. And then as a result of that, there was a strong representation, has always been a strong representation of academics working on Punjab and regional studies in universities, in the major universities. And of course, Chris Shackle was at SOAS for 40 years, a very distinguished linguist and specialist in Sikh Studies. But the kind of monies that are required to create a chair are quite substantial. I mean, the last chair we created in my faculty when I was dean was in Zoroastrian studies, and that required a tariff of £5 million. So as a result of that high threshold, people are reluctant to come forward, although I think with the creation of this position, if it reaches fruition, we will have a competitive environment. Whereas you know our community well. When we have one position, then everybody wants to create another position in their name. So I'm very hopeful that we will have a multiplier effect.
Right, it's like Gurdwaras, you'll be on every street corner.
Absolutely.
But in the US, most of the endowed chairs in Sikh Studies have come with community support. And in the community, funds have been raised in order to provide either the full salary and research money, or in the case of some universities like the University of California, the research funds that would make it possible for an endowed chair. But you're saying in the UK, the new chair came from Indian government sponsorship, but with some community support?
No, it is with some support of the government of India, not total support, and mostly it will be funded by the University of Birmingham as a strategic initiative. So it's a joint effort, and the University of Birmingham has created a new institute on India, and they feel that this will be a strategic investment as part of that new tilt towards India in terms of research and greater collaboration in students and faculty.
In the United States, part of the interest comes with the growth of something called ethnic studies in the United States, yes. Where the current is there a similar kind of academic program in the UK into which this?
Yes, I think that we have a strong development of ethnic and minority studies in the UK since the 1970s, and that's led to some level of community initiatives. For example, I would have put the initiative at Wolverhampton and some of the new universities in the same category. But the older institutions, the established institutions in the Golden Triangle and the major metropolitan universities like Birmingham, they have been very slow to move on this, partly because, as I've said, the interest has been related to the income. Unfortunately, higher education in UK has suffered more of a strain and challenges than the US, and as a result of the underfunding, all community-based initiatives have to be, by and large, fully funded, and that fully funded level is pretty high comparatively.
Mm-hmm. So it's understandable why the School of Oriental and African Studies, SOAS, would have Indian studies in general, and of course with Chris Shackle, Punjabi. I think my first primer on when I tried to learn Punjabi was from Chris Shackle. So I always thought the UK was a great center for Punjabi language studies and Sikh studies. But so it's understandable it would be at SOAS, and I guess at LSE, because LSE is the last time I was there, I commented to one of my friends, you know, there are people from every part of the world at LSE except England. And maybe that was an exaggeration, but LSE really is a global campus. But in other parts of the UK, you're saying that, well, there's Birmingham and Wolverhampton now, but Oxford and Cambridge, there's no hint of Sikh studies at either one of those distinguished institutions. Is that correct?
Yes, I think that, well, they have a lot of students who work on Punjabi studies or other disciplinary areas related to Punjab, India or development studies, but there's no focused program at either Cambridge or Oxford on Sikh studies as such. Mm-hmm. Interestingly, a few years ago, we had a meeting with colleagues in religious studies and interdisciplinary studies in Oxford. And again, they raise the same kind of issues that, you know, we have a very high threshold for development of such a program, and we need internal champions. And one of the interesting comments from that meeting was that Oxford prides itself on rejecting money, not accepting money, which was amazing. So I guess, you know, that was an indication of their priorities. But I'm quite optimistic. I think in the future, we probably will have major developments. One of the other sides of the difference between North America and the UK is that the funding regimes, endowment funding is different, and also the community development is slightly different. We don't have that large professional class that you have, as in California, which are keen to give, and they have incentives to give. And that's been difficult. That's been a very difficult challenge, as I found during my time at SOAS when we tried to get an endowed Sikh chair between 2011 and 2017.
How come that was not successful? I mean,
that was not successful.
You had a lot of power in the SOAS. You could have slowed.
We did, but the business community remains slightly detached from the concerns of the academic world, and perhaps somebody's out there listening, and I would be willing to pitch to them. I'll use this opportunity, but by and large, there's been a very lukewarm interest, and I think the same level of philanthropy that you have in the US, we simply don't have in the UK. I mean, I contrast this with, as a dean, I was able to raise £20 million from a foundation in Chicago for Hindu and Buddhist art in Southeast Asia. But the similar, even a small amount that we tried very hard to raise for Sikh studies was incredibly difficult.
But as you say, there are a number of scholars throughout the UK who do work on Punjab and Sikh studies in particular. So let's say there are some people who are watching this who are in the UK or planning to go to the UK, and they want to study Sikh studies. Where should they go? Should they go to Birmingham, Wolverhampton? Where should they go?
Well, they can go wherever, in a sense that the ideal research fits them. I mean, I wouldn't want to recommend any one area, because all my colleagues, both at Birmingham, Wolverhampton, and I've forgotten to mention a new young colleague, Jasjit Singh at Leeds. He's doing excellent work in policy area. So there's some very young, new up-and-coming scholars in Sikh studies. But Oxford, Cambridge, and London, partly because of their reputation, but partly because of the resources. For example, the British Library, which is a storehouse for resources on Sikhs, the British Museum, the National Army Museum, and the Royal Albert Museum. So London still remains the major center, the intellectual center for, and the cultural center for work and study of Sikhs. Having said that, I think, the colleagues working in provincial universities and Birmingham and West Midlands and in Leeds, they have excellent agendas, and they would be happy to explain their own work and communicate with students and encourage them to come.
So it depends on part with what aspect of Sikh studies people wanted to pursue. So as you were saying, if it's in the area of policy, this person leads, and you're saying, I think is it Professor Joel at Birmingham?
Professor Gerhard, yeah.
Gerhard, yeah. So what is his area of
it's her. I mean, she works primarily. She works primarily in the field of law and contemporary issues relating to Sikhs in the area of public policy and legal issues. But she has, developed over the years, developed a wider remit around broader interests in Sikh studies, especially gender studies.
Mm-hmm. People will have questions, and by the way, I just want to remind you what the question format is on this webinar. There's a Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. So if you have any questions, post them up there. And then when we come to the question period in a few minutes, I'll kind of go through them and ask the ones I think are most relevant and ask and try to go through as many as I possibly can, for which we have time, and ask Dr. Gurharpal to comment about them. I was going to ask you, I was going to ask you about your own teaching, because I know you're retired, but for years you were at SOAS, LSE. So were you able to teach courses in Sikh studies?
At SOAS, most of my time was taken up in managerial studies. Sorry,
you were
managerial responsibilities.
Right.
Not studies. So, sorry about that. But I did very little teaching. I mean, the one course that I did teach was not in Sikh studies. It was in religions and development. I had a strong interest in the area earlier. Before going to Birmingham, SOAS, at Birmingham, we had a major project on religions and development. Mm-hmm. So in that course, there were elements of relating to the Sikh experience, particularly the experience of the Dalit community in the West Midlands and transnational philanthropy. So that was a small element, but I didn't actually teach Sikh studies. Again, I'm not a classical scholar in Sikh studies. I've come to the subject by work on the politics and the history of Sikhs in the modern period. So, I didn't feel that I was competent to teach in areas of language or religion, but there were other colleagues who did teach, and we have at SOAS a colleague in development studies, and Professor Tej Puriwal. She teaches Punjabi, and she took on students from India and the UK who were interested in aspects of Sikh studies.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that, because as I was saying, Chris Shackle made such an impact. I don't know how he got involved in studying Punjabi or teaching it. Do you know the story on that?
I'm afraid I don't, but I do know that, when I last met him, like yourself, as a my first encounter with his work was buying his primer on Teach Yourself Punjabi.
Right.
And, but he is.
For years, that was it. That was really the only thing. And if you wanted to study Punjabi, you had to read that book. Yeah.
Well, absolutely. But, I think Chris's contribution in teaching of Punjabi, but also in promoting interest in the language and the sacred language of the Sikhs as an academic subject has been very strong and is reflected globally, and it's appreciated. And it's actually, one of the areas I think if there is any chair or any initiative that we need to maintain and develop.
So who replaced him? And was this interest continued?
That is the sad story, actually, is that we did have a replacement. And SOAS has always been a small institution and operating in an extremely difficult environment. And so we didn't really have, I think, a replacement for Chris. In fact, the languages and culture section of the school has suffered a significant reduction in staffing since.
But you say there is now someone who is teaching Punjabi at SOAS.
Yes, there is a colleague teaching Punjabi, but she is based in the Department of Development Studies, not in languages and cultures, and she, of course, has a specialism in Punjabi, but her main work is in gender and development.
But let's say someone who's watching this lives in London and says, "Okay, I want to study Punjabi." Where do they go?
Well, they can come to SOAS. Well, we have a language center where we can provide ad hoc specialist expertise in Punjabi training. Where we probably will be able to provide some kind of support if they want to take it to a higher degree level, but not the kind of expertise I think that existed in the past. There may be some colleagues. I have been out of it for about 2 years, so I can't really comment on the expertise is there. But certainly, if we don't have somebody around, we can find colleagues or find colleagues in other institutions who can help support research students. So
it's not a lost cause, but it might take a little looking around. Are all these programs open only to enroll students, or can just anybody who's interested in Punjabi take them? And are there any other kinds of resources that you know of, maybe in public schools or technical schools or in gurdwaras for learning Punjabi? Yeah.
Well, outside of the university, there's quite a lot of support for Punjabi teaching in schools and in gurdwaras. So there is a substantial infrastructure within the community for Punjabi teaching. I think the problem arises at the higher level. It arises at the level of when you want to teach language and literature at a degree or postgraduate level. And I think that at that level, the provision is a bit sparse, although the demand within the community has been quite strong.
Yeah, you're right to point that out. I mean, the emphasis of this webinar and our conversations have been on higher education in colleges and universities. Mm-hmm. But we shouldn't overlook the fact that in high schools and other academies, Sikh Studies in its own way is thriving, and that there are opportunities to learn Punjabi and learn about the Sikh tradition outside of the 4-year colleges and universities that have been the focus of our conversations. So we don't want people who are watching this to get the impression that there aren't opportunities out there. There are, and this is true in the United States as well. You know, I'm impressed with some of the attempts, particularly in areas of California where there are large Sikh communities around Yuba City and Marysville, for example, in the San Joaquin Valley, to focus on the Sikh tradition and provide language training for kids who want to learn more about their own traditions. And I'm sure that's true in the UK as well, as you were just now saying. Am I right?
Yes, that is true. Where there's a large concentration of the Sikh community, there is strong provision for language training. And now, you know, we are speaking a day before when the next decennial census will be held in the UK. So tomorrow, the Sikhs will be returning their figures, and we will probably find out that, you know, the population figure has increased significantly, and that will lead to further calls for language provisions for Punjabi in schools.
But it's not just numerical. I mean, the importance of the Sikh community politically, culturally, socially is very significant in the UK as it is in the United States. So, I mean, the Punjabis in general and Sikh Punjabis in particular have a way of being noticed, you know, because of their prominence, their expertise, and their willingness to assert themselves. And so, I'm sure this will make a difference.
Absolutely, I think that's you know, we are. Compared to the USA, a very small country here in the UK, and it's heavily centralized. So, and given the, you know, the colonial connection, the past with the Sikhs and the Raj, even as a small minority, the Sikhs can always get their voice heard politically, and it does have an impact. And it has, you know, resulted in some kind of you know, what I've written in with a colleague, Darshan Tatla in Sikhs in Britain, a kind of unique position which enables Sikhs to opt out from general rule making, you know, somewhat similar to the Jewish community as well.
You just now mentioned your own work, and let's talk about that for a bit, because you've done some very interesting studies of the ethnographic development of Sikhs in the UK. Can you tell us a little bit of how you got involved in that, and what were some of your major findings?
Well, the Sikhs in Britain book was actually written while I was at Birmingham. I had shifted from my background's in political science, and after 9/11, I wanted to move into the area of religion and politics. And then I took up a position in interreligious relations at Birmingham in the Department of Theology and Religions. So I thought, as part of that relocation, I should write about the Sikh community in Britain. And with my colleague Darshan Tatla, we embarked on this study, which was to try to develop a historical and a sociological account of the Sikhs in Britain. And it was an interesting work. It was a work which brought together our research over the previous 2 decades, and was an attempt to see at a greater level. One is it was a community study of what had happened to the community and how it grown demographically and adapted. But more importantly, it was about how Sikhs fitted into the framework of multiculturalism within Britain, and what kind of lessons we could learn from that comparatively. And that was very interesting, because the Sikhs were, you know, for reasons you've outlined, as being a very vocal, visible, and assertive community. They were able to over time become the pioneers of multiculturalism in Britain for getting protection from the state for things like the dress code and turbans and so forth. And they were able to do it quite effectively, not only as a mode of protest against discrimination, but also, I think, largely because of the historical connections with the Raj. And that was very, very interesting to learn and study.
But these issues have continued. It's not as if everything is happy and everybody's,
Oh, no.
all of the issues of multiculturalism have been solved.
Not at all. I mean, it's a constant struggle. So, one victory then is followed by another reversal. So in a sense, many of the issues on which the Sikhs thought they had made advances were then challenged when some of the rulings became apparent in the European court, as for example, on wearing turbans, on the dress code and the kirpan. So it's a constant struggle. But I think, but overall, I would say that now, the post 9/11 and post the Khalistan movement, that the British state is far more responsive to Sikh demands than it was previously.
You mentioned this kind of in passing, but I'm kind of interested in how you yourself got interested in the field of Sikh studies, because your academic career didn't start out that way. You say
Sure.
you were in political science and you issues of industrial relations and things of this nature. And you just now said that 9/11 was a critical moment for you.
Sure.
The Khalistan uprising, to some extent, also had an impact. Tell us what was going on in your life and your mind and your thinking that kind of created this turn towards the field of Sikh studies.
Well, sometimes the path one takes is often dictated by events than what you want to do. I mean, I started out having done a degree in government at the LSE and then a master's in industrial relations at Warwick. I went back to the LSE to do a research degree and was actually working on management and union relations. I think in retrospect, I probably would have been better off, at least as a career choice, if I stayed in that. But as you know, in the early 80s, things were hotting up in Punjab. And I just felt Britain and industrial relations in the early 80s was rather boring, whereas the events that were happening in Punjab were far more interesting. And at that time,
and I assume you have family roots in the Punjab.
Absolutely. My father went back to Punjab. My mother and father went back to Punjab in '82, and we still are very much rooted in Punjab. So
I know Punjab. I think I've gone to every area of this of the region by bus. So what part of the Punjab?
We're from the district of Hoshiarpur, which is known to close to Chandigarh, but also is known to produce, known for its intellectuals.
As the name would imply.
Okay, yeah. So as a result of that events in Punjab, I then shifted to a politics degree, and there was my supervisor at the time, then Professor Tom Nossiter, was doing a major project on communism in India. And he then asked me whether I'd be interested in looking at a failed communist movement in Punjab. So that was my entry point. But it got me interested in
headquarters in Jalandhar, the Desh
Yes,
Yadgar.
Yeah. They were based in the Yadgar, Desh Bhagat Yadgar Hall.
Yeah, they were all old Gutterites, and I remember going.
Yes.
It was the headquarters of the CPIM, Communist Party Marxist, in Jalandhar, and up on the wall there was a picture of the Campanile at Berkeley, my university, because of its connection with the Gutter Party.
Absolutely. And
I,
yeah,
I felt I felt a very special relationship to Punjabi
yeah,
communism because of their association with
yeah.
Berkeley.
Well, it was an incredible journey, to write about um, Punjabi communism from the Ghadar movement to the Naxalites. And
Right.
in a way, it was about writing about the history of Punjab
Mhm,
over that very long period.
mhm,
And it got me interested. And as a result of that, then went on to explore the other issues around partition, the Sikh national question, um, and the long-term consequences of partition, which have still um, dominated my work, the
mhm.
partition itself and its long-term implications.
Well, these are all very important issues, and it really brings up this larger topic, which I've asked each one of our participants in these conversations. And is, what do you think Sikh Studies is? How do you find the field? Because at one point you said, "Oh, I don't feel qualified to teach Sikh Studies because I don't know the history or the the scriptures, the Guru Granth Sahib in and out." But as you've been talking, Sikh Studies is about much more than that. It's about the diaspora of the Sikh community. It's about religion and development. It's about religion and politics. Is all of this Sikh Studies, or do you still think, oh well, there's that central core, that old-fashioned idea that it's just the history and the scriptures?
Well, I think in a way, Mark, you've summarized it quite well. And perhaps I'm a bit of a traditionalist, and I've always veered away from Sikh studies. I've been working on the Sikhs, I've always thought the Sikhs and Punjab were interesting for explaining, more comparative and broader questions rather than questions only about Sikhs. So that was my entry point. Even if it was on the communist movement, what does it tell us about communism in India much more broadly? And if it's on nationalism and the Sikhs, then it's about nation state building and religious nationalism. So I think I still, perhaps it's because of the connection with SOAS, I still have this bias that Sikh studies is about language, culture, and theology, and I'm not competent to speak about it. But I'm also aware that we live in a different world. We live in a globalized world, and then the subject of Sikh studies has changed to some extent. And it's right and proper that other disciplinary developments are recognized, and we acknowledge that. However, I would add, I think there is any subject area, when you have studies attached to it, can become free and loose. So at some point, there is an intellectual effort needed to draw down the boundaries. So if we are talking about the same subject area, otherwise we're just making a contribution which is neither here or there. So it's maybe something for our, very well-paid professors to reflect upon.
Well, that's a good answer. And while you were talking, it was just with one eye looking at some of the questions that have come up. And so I want to turn to those. I have a question from my colleague Pashara Singh at the University of California, Riverside, who said, you haven't mentioned anything about the journal Sikh Formations that you had a very important role in helping to launch. And he said also the International Journal of Punjab Studies. Can you say something about these journals and how they
Yes, thank you, Pashara, and hello. Thank you very much for that question. I think starting with the International Journal of Punjab Studies, that grew out of something called the Punjab Research Group, which was founded after or close to 1984, when a group of us who were doing our PhDs at the time felt that we needed to, again, to understand 1984 in a broader context. So the Punjab Research Group produced a large number of papers, and in the early 90s, we set up the International Journal of Punjab Studies, myself and along with other colleagues. And that was a very successful journal that eventually, I think, went to your institution, Mark, in Santa Barbara. The Sikh Formations was formed in 2005 after 9/11, and I'm, a bit like yourself and perhaps many others, I felt that the return of religion was much more important than it was given credit for in some of the disciplinary areas. And we needed to focus a bit more on Sikhs and on the Sikh question. And the journal has been driven largely by our co-editor, Arvind Pal at Michigan. And so he takes much of the, he does much of the heavy lifting on the journal. I have, contributed to some of the articles, and we have while I'm at it, I'd like to mention a special issue which is coming out on the SGPC and the Akali Dal's 100th anniversary. To mark the anniversary, we have produced this special issue. So the journal has been great. It's given a forum to many young scholars and different points of views and different voices. So we're very pleased, and I'm also pleased in a way. I think that I represent a continuity, a link with our previous endeavors.
Any trouble getting articles, or have they just flowed right in?
On the contrary, we have actually gone from fewer issues to always going to more and more issues, and it's the quality of the contributions are amazing, and we've had excellent feedback from students and contributors, so some of the articles are getting huge hits. So it's great to have good competition with other journals in the field, and I wish that more would come online and give us a run for our money.
Excellent. We have a couple questions about those endowed chairs or trying to create chairs in Sikh Studies. Rishi Singh wants to know whether the issue with of getting funds is complicated by the relationship with business or the corporate world. Is there any kind of possibility there of tapping into those funds and that kind of support?
Well, as I indicated earlier in my conversation, the corporate world has remained largely aloof. And it's not that we did not approach corporate donors. We approached somebody very well established and a prominent Sikh businessman who showed interest, and then they pulled out. I mean, obviously there are many factors in this process, and then it may well be the circumstances have changed. But if there are donors out there, I'm sure universities would welcome them. And they, as we have welcomed donations and endowments at SOAS in the recent years when I've been there. So there's no problems there. It is clear. I think the key issue is having a clear idea of what the donors want, and an understanding of how universities operate. That universities are places where you donate and gift, and then the academics and the institution manages that award.
Well, so if Jeff Bezos came to you with a bunch of money, you wouldn't turn him down?
Well, we have due process, and of course there's lots of people with lots of money these days, okay. And some of that has to be treated very carefully.
Parmala Tariwala has a related question on the philanthropy, and he's asking about pattern in the UK is compared to the US? And are there characteristics of the Sikh communities in the two different countries that might make a difference in their interest in providing philanthropy? And the argument is that the Sikhs having a longer multi-generational history in the UK might make them more prone to be philanthropic. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think, again, that's a very important point. In terms of philanthropy, the tax structure we have in the UK here is not that attractive to creation of foundations and towards giving. Secondly, the employment profile historically of the community in the UK is very different from that in the US. So it is only, in the last 10 years that we are seeing large growth of corporate and philanthropic giving, but not on any great scale. And thirdly, I would also add the point that I mentioned before, that UK is a highly centralized country, and a lot of attention and power is concentrated in London as opposed to the regions. And because of this, I mean, this is my view, that there is a certain reluctance to create rival centers of power. So if you do endow a couple of chairs, then I think in the eyes of some of the power holders and the gatekeepers, they would become rival centers of power vis-a-vis Whitehall and Westminster.
Interesting. In comparing the communities, I'm just thinking about the US situation where the early Sikh Punjabi community in the first decades of the 20th century were primarily became farmers in Yuba City and Marysville, and some did extremely well because they knew the irrigation practices. They could develop farming with an expertise that some of the other communities couldn't. And as I say, they've done extremely well. And then there are the newcomers since the change in the immigration laws in 1965 that tend to be more technologically proficient, more administrators, a different kind of category of people, but also of Sikh background. And both of those have sufficient resources and interest to develop positions in Sikh studies. Is the pattern of immigration and the kind of communities in the UK different in that regard?
Yes, in the UK, the majority of this Sikh community are descendants from what one might call, I mean, this is not in any way intended to be pejorative, a labor diaspora. They were post-war migrants. There was a small scattering of businessmen, people who had historically traded with UK, but by and large they formed the industrial working class, and it is from them that the community has developed in large measure, although it has changed somewhat since the last 20 years because of globalization and the freedom of movement for businessmen to come to UK and the new businesses that have emerged in IT and finance and banking sector. So the composition of the community is very different, both in Europe and in the UK compared to US and Canada. I mean, Canada, I think, resembles much more the kind of state we have in the UK. But even then, as I've tried to argue, there are other factors which are inhibiting the development of the endowed chairs, and that is the high threshold and the institutional structure of the universities.
And there's another question that I kind of hesitate to ask because I don't want to imply that I in any way agree with the assumption, but the question is that there is an image of the Sikh youth in the UK that they are into gangs and drug use. And is that still the case? And first of all, I don't know whether it was ever the case, but do you agree that there is a kind of, I don't know, a kind of a bad press that has to be countered in some way?
Well, I think if you look at any Sikh community anywhere in the diaspora, you will get some feedback about behavior relating to that kind of activity. However, my own view, and as a social scientist, I think that is not the general norm. There is delinquent behavior, however you may define that everywhere, but it doesn't seem to represent the norm. And certainly, we found the research Darshan and I did on Sikh youth, that they were doing quite well in education by and large, and they were, outperforming the indigenous white community as a representative sample. So I think there's very strong empirical evidence that that is not the case. There may be, pockets and anecdotal evidence, but it doesn't represent the Sikh youth or the Sikh community.
Yeah, I mean, the image that a lot of us have is that the youth there are into Bhangra rap.
Well, precisely. London was the base, the foundations of Bhangra Kool in the early 90s, and
Yeah.
then it took off and overtook Bollywood.
While we're on that topic, my colleague Parminder Bhachu at Clark University talks about the way in which Punjabi dress has influenced fashion in the UK. And because there is this, close multicultural mix within the UK, I guess it's inevitable that there is this kind of blending. But do you see some of these cultural syntheses going on?
Yes, I mean, Britain's changed quite a lot, from the 60s and 70s, and the stiff upper lip, a kind of attitude, that's often identified with the UK. So there's there's a melding of cultures and traditions, and evident in popular music, in food. Punjabi food is very popular, as is all Indian food at the moment, and in music, popular music. We have top of the charts, and songs, Punjabi music, Punjabi songs often going, selling very well as mainstream songs.
Do non-Punjabis ever come to the Gurdwaras?
That's a very interesting question. Yes, they do. They come.
Probably come for longer.
Well, I think that's the obvious response, but I think they also come because there are a growing number of interracial marriages now. So you are beginning to have a kind of a white, non-white kind of Sikh community, and families and their children. So Gurdwaras compositions are changing. They're not the kind of traditional Gurdwaras that we knew. So the Gurdwaras are beginning to reflect social change around them.
Kay Singh has just added to a question about the image of Punjabi youth, and said the music thing also featured in Blinded by the Light. Is that a movie or TV or series or something? And then it said we used to hear about drug use in the UK and Southall being a bad section of London near the airport. Pockies and EastEnders were associated with Sikh youths who were lost to the parents and community. But hopefully things have reversed. And you're saying that things have never been that bad.
Well, I think, you know, I don't watch much TV these days, and you know, I'd be weary of popular representation. You know, as a trained social scientist, I would look at the evidence and then come to conclusions rather than what's represented in the newspapers, I think.
Yeah, good for you. One last question back to the curriculum, because you mentioned that the kind of the colonial past and has brought many Punjabis to the UK, but there is also a kind of colonial mentality that lingers certainly socially, but also academically. Academically, the question is whether there has been any attempt to decolonialize the syllabus, particularly around teaching Sikh and Punjab studies in the UK.
Well, it's interesting you say that. The decolonizer curriculum movement began at SOAS in the last few years, and it is taking roots, and it's getting quite strong in terms of critiquing colonialism and the unintended and intended consequences. As far as Sikh studies goes, I think we are already quite far ahead because of the development in the subject in the last 2 decades, particularly the scholars working in critical studies who have brought to attention the pervasive impact of colonialism on the construction of Sikh identity. And so in a sense, to answer the question, I think the pendulum has probably swung too far in view of some in favor of decolonizing, and perhaps, you know, there is a case for reflecting on whether there is a Sikh subject left, you know, so you know, so in a kind of a brief way to answer your question, I think Sikh studies as a subject really doesn't need to, well, of course it needs to address issues relating to decolonization, but I think the exercise has been carried out with quite a rigor. And most people who now teach Sikh studies are very sensitive to that, at least the ones that I know. So perhaps inadvertently they would bring in assumptions about colonizations. But I think especially the latest generation of Sikh studies scholars in Britain are tuned to the realities of the decolonizing the curriculum movement.
Well, but you were talking about the history of the texts the text and the history of Sikhism as being kind of basic, you know, Sikh studies, but that is a kind of, you know, Christian way of looking at a religious tradition, and that some of the early scholars of the Gurharpal, you know, applied biblical textual scholarship, which is, of course, you know, useful scholarship, but I think that we can interrogate all aspects of the way in which we look at different cultures around the world, because academia is maybe the last kind of vestige of you know, Eurocentric dominated cultural pattern around the world. Not that it's always bad, but it, you know, rightfully, as you say, it needs to be questioned.
Well, I'm not sure I agree with you there, because you know, the text can be analyzed in many ways, and it doesn't necessarily mean that you're beholden to the kind of intellectual heritage of Eurocentrism. For example, again, in my previous department at Birmingham, we had the Institute of Textual Studies. They were working on the Bible. But there were scholars who were tearing the Bible apart. They were using modern computer techniques to decode the structure of the Bible and so forth. And why not similar kind of exercises to be done on the Granth or elements of the Sikh,
and the Gurharpal is such a rich mixture of textual sources. It's just so.
Yeah, I mean, it's open to that kind of textual analysis, which is yet to be done, and I think we have shied away from doing that, and but in a sense, I think there. I think I'm betraying my biases here. I'm strongly influenced by A.D. Smith and his teaching on nationalism. So I think where one is always looking for some element of the core, or at least the symbolic representation of the core.
But by the way, I've just been informed that that Blinded by the Light is a movie that was made by the great UK movie producer Gurinder Chadha. Gurinder Chadha, the same person who created Bend It Like Beckham and so many other wonderful films. And now that I know who made Blinded by the Light, I think probably I should go and see it. We could probably download it from some source. Let me see. We have just a time for maybe one or two questions. Rishi Singh has another question on what about the sources associated with Sikh studies, especially in the context of Persian sources, Braj sources, and Punjabi languages? Are those kind of resources? Can people study Braj, for example, in order to get? We're talking about the study of the Guru Granth Sahib. You need to know Braj in order to be able to do that kind of scholarship.
I think they can and they should. I mean, it's essential that they are trained in a variety of languages, and Persians are absolutely essential if you want to work on Sikh studies, or at least Sikh history, for example. There's a huge collection of Persian sources in the British Library, but also in the Lahore Museum. The documentation on the there's Ranjit Singh's state is largely in Persian. So those, the kind of all-round familiarity with those languages is essential to being a rich scholar of the tradition. So a rich understanding of, sorry, I meant to say that a rich understanding of those languages is very, very essential. And you can see it in the works of MacLeod and Chris Shackle and Professor Jagtar Singh Garewal, and that's in a way I think that that makes some of their writings timeless.
By the way, I just saw Garewal not too long ago. He's still writing away. You would think someone of his age would give up, but he's always working on his next project. And we all scholars never die. We just keep on going. Till they
likewise, I was in Chandigarh last year and I went to see Professor Garewal. I think he's 92, a bit frail, but extremely lucid.
He's doing wonderful work. When I asked him what he was working on, he's revising his Guru Nanak in history. He said the time has come to kind of reconsider the sources and to make some significant changes. And what a marvelous scholar he is, and what wonderful work, what great contribution to the field of Sikh studies. Well, Gurharpal Singh, this has just been such a pleasure. I've learned so much. I could talk with you forever, but I don't think either you or I want to do that. But I want to congratulate you on all the good things you've done and the kind of new developments that we've learned about in Birmingham and elsewhere. And I'm convinced that UK is going to continue to flourish as a great center for Sikh studies around the world. And your role in helping to do that is not inconsiderable. So Thank you so much for joining us in this webinar series. And I look forward to let everybody know that the series is going to continue. The original flyer had a limited number of people pictured, but there are now many more that will continue into the spring. So I'm looking forward to the continued conversation. So thank you very much for joining us, and we'll look forward in 2 weeks to our next conversation.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.